We're gods and we're returning to God. We can't make sense of our suffering. We're manipulated by media, we're manipulated by advertising, we're manipulated by the tyranny of the majority. The famous Ottoman philosopher and theologian Toshko Brizade, he says, happiness, sa'ada, is the individual reaching the perfection, the level of perfection that is possible for him. In Imam al-Ghazali, he says, the free person is the one who has conquered his own passions, he's conquered his own desire.
And what does happiness mean from an Islamic perspective?
I remember, in the heat of the Gaza crisis, I'm not a person who cries, but I'd often have to just remove myself from company and go and cry.
And actually even non-Muslims perceive that. There is this amazing quality to them.
We have been sent a Shariah. God has placed us here for a purpose. Don't ever despair of God's comfort, because He will resolve all matters. Happiness in the Islamic tradition is...
Hasan Spiker, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back to The Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much.
Well, it's so wonderful to have you with us, Brother Hasan. Now, today we're going to talk about a really important topic, and a topic I've been thinking a lot about for the last year or 2 years, really, and it's a topic of happiness. And what does happiness mean from an Islamic perspective, and how do we contrast that maybe when we look at Western philosophy and Western ideology and how Westerners potentially understand happiness. Now, we live in a world which I suppose is dominated by an ideology that is defined by the West. And so many of us today define happiness on social media and beyond as, I suppose, the acquisition of material, of sort of a type of pleasure that one finds, a pleasure of the flesh possibly, that one finds in this consumerist society. And I want to get to the bottom of, okay, what is happiness from an Islamic lens, and how do we define happiness? And maybe that's a good way to start today's conversation. Let's define the category of happiness, or define the word happiness. I mean, is that even like a fair definition to recall or to make when it comes to like the Islamic paradigm?
Well, I think it's such a broad and ambiguous term, happiness, but it has all of the hallmarks also of being almost a basic philosophical category, or something that's so self-evident that when we try to define it, we find that we were already certain that we knew what it meant. But then when you ask me, well, what is it then? It's awfully difficult to get started. So the basic philosophical question regarding happiness in terms of the philosophical discourse is happiness synonymous with well-being? Or is it something else which may well be related, but is basically a psychological state? And the real litmus test there is, could you have all of the factors of well-being or flourishing? And by well-being, we mean flourishing. And we'll discuss more what we mean by that. And still be unhappy. And so I would say that when it comes to the Islamic paradigm, and this is something that we'll unpack quite a lot, if you are genuinely flourishing and have genuine well-being, then you are happy in terms of the psychological state. It's not really possible, short of an actual mental imbalance, to not be happy in terms of the psychological state if you have all of the factors of well-being. Now, when it comes to how we look at happiness in the West, it's obviously primarily a feeling, and we seek various means in order to realize that feeling. But essentially, we want to feel happy. Now, when it comes to the Islamic conception, and this really, I suppose, evokes a larger philosophical and metaphysical context when you're contrasting the Islamic tradition and post-Enlightenment modernity. It really is a question of your metaphysics, because the real question to ask from the Islamic perspective is, what is a human being such that he or she can flourish? Because it's not flourishing for a plant or a cow or some other creature. It's a human being, the well-being of a human being, the flourishing of a human being. So it really rests in the Islamic context on answering the question, what is a human being? And the same thing in the Western context, because whether metaphysics is acknowledged or not, it's still there lurking in the background. And so very often, of course, what's happening in the Western context is a materialist conception of human nature is being assumed in the background when we get started with the question, what is happiness? What is the well-being that is conducive to happiness? How do we achieve it? But without that assumption, which is obviously extremely important, ever being really questioned or examined, and then we wonder why it's not working, why we're not happy, why we can have all of the self-help books in the world and all the how to flourish and well-being and so on in the world, and people are still not happy. So it's impossible from the Islamic perspective, and to be honest, the broader pre-modern context is very, very similar. There's a huge amount of commensurability there if you look at medieval Europe, for example.
Right.
The broad Islamic principle is, well, how can there be flourishing unless there is a conception of human nature? Because we need to know what this being is who is supposed to flourish.
Right.
And unless there's a hierarchy of being, which is, what is the purpose of this human being? What is his place in the overall hierarchy of creation that God has ordained? And so those are the basic questions. So yes, I mean, it can be very, very much an anachronistic question or an anatopistic question, which is the place version of anachronistic, if we don't really clarify our terms in that metaphysical context, because very often the modern world wants to ignore the metaphysical context, but it's still there lurking in the background, the assumptions, whereas the traditional Islamic view is very much more facing up to those questions and their absolute irreducible importance. They can't be dismissed.
Right. Okay. So let's like unpack all of that. Firstly, am I right in saying when we think about Western philosophy, we can broadly break it down into post-Enlightenment and pre-Enlightenment? And if we think about, I don't know, pre-modern Western philosophy, I mean, there's been a shift. I mean, pre-modernity valued virtue and purpose as opposed to post-modernity, which values pleasure and satisfaction. Is that a fair sort of delineation to make between the two epochs of Western philosophy?
I agree. I think that's very, very fundamental.
Yeah.
It makes me think of John Stuart Mill, the famous liberalist empiricist philosopher's definition of happiness. And he defined it as simply as, well, he says, happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain. And it sounds so simplistic, it's almost crude. Right. And you have to remember, John Stuart Mill is an extraordinarily sophisticated philosopher. He has his system of logic, aside from all of his work in liberalism and so on, which is extremely elaborate and complex and sophisticated.
Yeah.
And in a way, you feel that there's a deliberate move to make matters metaphysical simplistic, because what they're trying to say is there's nothing really there.
Right.
So essentially, this is an empiricist understanding of happiness. And what one has to remember is, in the traditional context where all of the sciences are interrelated, the question of what is happiness is very, very much linked up. It's very much bound up with the question of what is the good, which is the fundamental question of ethics. And so essentially, when Mill defines happiness as pleasure and the absence of pain, he's simply defining the good in his empiricist philosophy, in his specific case, utilitarianism, which is that the good is pleasure, and that is a hedonistic theory of the good, which is very, very much the hallmark of empiricism. And it goes back to Locke, and even earlier, but Locke is the kind of archetypal figure when it comes to empiricism, and especially an empiricist ethics.
And so empiricism, explain that to us, please.
Well, empiricism is essentially the claim that all of our knowledge, in order to be real and to actually correspond to reality, must be rooted in the sensible world, experienceable via the senses.
Yeah.
And while sophisticated philosophers like Locke and Mill are well aware that there's more than that, because, for goodness sake, everything we've said for the last 10 minutes is not really empirically rooted. We are talking about this abstract thing and that abstract thing, and so how are you going to root it in some sort of sense experience? But their claim is it is ultimately rooted in a sense experience. So you might have an idea of a sense object, and then you have an idea about that idea about a sense object. So it's the claim that all of our knowledge, in order to be genuine knowledge, must be rooted in the experiences of the senses. Now, if that is your epistemological claim, you can see why they would choose pleasure as their definition of the good. Because what else are you going to choose?
Yeah.
There aren't many other options. How are you going to root moral properties in empirical reality? How are you going to root aesthetic properties in empirical reality? And how are you going to root metaphysical claims in empirical reality? It's very, very difficult.
Right.
So essentially, pleasure is one of those things that you can, in some sense, measure, and in that sense, it is empirically rooted. So again, you can see the way that a set of metaphysical assumptions and by extension epistemological assumptions are kind of narrowing our definition of happiness so that it becomes this reductive conception of happiness as pleasure.
Here in Gaza, hospitals are working under unimaginable pressure. Sick people, injured people, and also pregnant women are coming to hospitals every single day. We also need to know that hospitals are working with very low resources, making the health sector deteriorating every single day. I'm Hind Al-Khudri and I'm reporting from Gaza. In 2024, Baitulmaal began its emergency medical missions in Gaza. I met two of the doctors who came from the United States during that first mission. Since then, more than a dozen missions have followed. We're currently in Nasser Hospital, and those are two pediatric specialists that are here in Gaza to help children, treat them, and help them overcome their wounds. As Gaza's healthcare system is collapsing under war, these missions are very important to help save lives of the Palestinians here across the Gaza Strip. When you support these missions, you help bring in doctors, treatment, and hope for families who cannot wait.
Please visit btml.us/thinkingmuslim to donate now. Okay. So let's then contrast that with, I will come back to Western philosophy in a second, but let's contrast that then with the Islamic concepts of happiness. I mean, there's Sa'ada and Falah, and, there is a sort of a conception of happiness which seems to be different to that of pleasure and pain. Like, explain the difference between those Islamic concepts and others and Western notions of happiness.
Absolutely. Well, the famous Ottoman philosopher and theologian Toshko Brizade, he's a 16th century
you
theologian.
Mentioned him the last time, I think.
Did I mention him last time?
Yeah.
He's one of my favorites, so I can't stop mentioning him.
Really?
But he defines happiness when he says, السعادة هي بلوغ الشخص بحركته الإرادية إلى كمال يمكنه ويليق به. Right? So he says happiness, as-sa'ada, is the individual reaching the perfection, the level of perfection that is possible for him based on his individual nature, that befits his individual nature. And he goes on to say that this is in accordance with his isti'adad al-awwal. He says it's bihasab al-isti'adad al-awwal, which is his original disposition and capacity as an individual. And this really means in God's knowledge, like what God knows about what he's capable of. And of course, we as individuals, we get to grips in the unfolding of our life to a certain extent with what we're capable of, and we learn that ourselves. But God already knows. So he says, as such, the perfection, the kamal of every individual is going to be different, and therefore the happiness of every individual is going to be different.
Right.
So it's quite an extraordinary thing.
Yeah.
But as you can see, it's very much teleological in the sense that it's about, as you said, flourishing in accordance with a purpose and fulfilling a nature and so on. But the very interesting thing about Toshka Prasada, if you compare him to earlier thinkers like Miskaway, who are, let's say, more explicitly Aristotelian, is that he says there is a fundamental difference of opinion when it comes to, and it's basically the contrast between those earlier Islamic philosophers who are more or less reliant on Plato and Aristotle, by no means solely reliant, and the later thinkers who have essentially effected this synthesis, which brings in aspects of scripture, the Quran and the Hadith, brings in aspects of self-purification and what you might call mysticism, and synthesizes all of that into a much more holistic vision. So what he says is, our conception of happiness is going to be slightly different to that of Aristotle and Plato, because we believe that the body is an integral part of human nature, rather. It's an integral part of the individual, the being of the individual, and an integral part of human nature. And so it's not just the spirit using a body as an instrument. And he says the reason for this is because we have been sent a Shariah, which allows us to sanctify the corporeal world fully, and that also takes into consideration the fact that God has placed us here for a purpose. It's not just this kind of awkward embodiment, as you can feel often with Plato or the Neoplatonists, where we find ourselves in a body, we really would like to get rid of it because it's in the way of our vision of the forms, and we don't know quite what to do with it, with all the kind of the embodiment, the egoistic aspect to embodiment, the physical needs, and all of that kind of thing. And so there tends to be, rather like some conceptions of Christian asceticism as well, this sense of a rejection of the corporeal, the rejection of the body. Right. Whereas, of course, the Sharia brings us the means to the total and complete sanctification of the embodied state.
Give me some examples of how the Sharia does that.
The Sharia does that by giving you a ruling for every single aspect of embodied life, which represents God's will. God has ordained, because he's the creator of the physical world, that human interaction with the physical world, because we are the vicegerent of the world, should have a means of drawing close to God in every single action.
Right.
So that starts with tahara and purification, wudu, the way that we use the bathroom, the way that we do wudu and prepare for prayer, the actual physical movements of the prayer, because you could think this is a matter of the spirit. Why do you need to have prostration and you need to have the ruku' and so on? It has a ruling for our monetary transactions, and it has a ruling for the way that we speak to each other, and it has a ruling for the hierarchy that should obtain within a family, and so on. So it's a comprehensive account in which, in some sense, heaven is joined to earth. Heaven comes down to earth in a revelation, so that we might return to heaven and, in fact, elevate the embodied state so that it becomes continuous with the heavenly and, in a way, actually heavenly. And that's why happiness in the Islamic tradition is very much about embracing our human nature as embodied creatures. And that means embracing, to a large extent, a lot of pain and suffering, because that pain and suffering is there to help us to reach our kamal, which is our perfection, because it's a specifically human kamal. And that means going through very, very difficult things, potentially, but which, again, never lead us into states of despair, because there's a purpose underlying it all. So Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, لنبلونكم بشيء من الخوف والجوع ونقص من الأموال والأنفس والثمرات وبشر الصابرين الذين إذا أصابتهم مصيبة قالوا إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. Right? We will surely test you with fear and hunger and losing wealth and losing people. وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ. And give glad tidings to the patient who, if a tribulation afflicts them, say, surely we are God's and unto him we are returning. So why this tribulation? Why this suffering? And why in an Islamic conception of happiness, we're not running away from pain and suffering, but it is always resolved in our vision of God, in our knowledge of God, in our knowledge of His qadr, in our tawakkul, that everything can be made right. Because this is not the, I would say it's a real world, but it's not the capital R real world. It's not the ultimate world. You know, Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, وَإِنَّ الدَّارَ الْآخِرَةِ لَهِيَ الْحَيَوَانِ. It's the akhirah, which is the real life. This is just a preparation. And everything can be made right. Every reunion can happen. Everything can be resolved. Any problem that anyone has in this world can be solved in the best possible way. And that's why you have the example of some of the Anbiya, like Sayyidina Yaqub in Surah Yusuf. And we might think, well, he's one of the Anbiya. You know, far be it from him, but why would he complain? Why would he be sad? Right? He says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أسفا على يوسف وابيضت عيناه من الحزن وهو كظيم. He says, Ya asafa. It's a very, 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 very expressive lament for the loss of Yusuf. And he became so taken by sorrow that he went blind. But then just after, he says, لا تيأسوا من روح الله. Don't ever despair of God's comfort, because He will resolve all matters, and it's not incompatible with Him undergoing that pain and submitting to that pain as part of the human condition and as a purificatory process, but always with this awareness that God will resolve everything in justice and goodness and beauty. So it's a very, very fundamentally different conception to the broad post-Enlightenment conception. And of course, again, it all goes back to metaphysics, ultimately.
Right, so by metaphysics you mean an attachment to God, you know, a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm just, while you were speaking there, I was thinking about, because of course the world has looked on in Gaza, looked at Gaza and this genocide and subhanAllah, so many of our brothers and sisters in Gaza, you know, have endured immense hardship. And,
of course.
And, you know, there is you feel the hurt in their voices and of course, they've lost so much. You know, there are people that I've met who've lost 80, 90 members of their own family, you know, in airstrikes across these last two or 3 years. Now, I suppose the question for me would be, like, can we attach? Because there is a contentment, let's say. You know, you see some of these Muslims in Gaza, and you feel there is and actually even non-Muslims perceive that there is this amazing quality to them, that regardless of the hardship, they remain steadfast and content. Like, would we claim that to be a state of happiness? Would we say that that's not happiness in a temporal sense, right? But that's more, a contentment linked to the akhirah. Like, how would you describe a state therein?
I think it's also a contentment related to halawat al-iman, the sweetness of faith that the Prophet ﷺ talks about in several authentic hadiths.
Yeah.
So there is a sweetness of faith which, aside from the akhirah, not in any way to take away from the great status of the akhirah and the extreme importance of the akhirah in providing that solace.
Yeah.
But it's also an immediate solace which comes from staying true to the revelation, staying true to iman in such a difficult state, which many experience brings a sweetness, an actual feeling of being connected, of this inayah, of being looked after by Allah Ta'ala. And so it's not in any way to belittle the pain, or to make light of the pain, rather. And that's the thing about pain. When we look at it in a kind of problem of evil context, we tend to think, well, God could have just not put it there, and He's a loving God, and so there's this confusion. But the extraordinary thing is that whenever there is pain, there's Muhammad Jalal giving all of these extraordinary podcasts and interviewing all of these extraordinary people like Sami Hamdi and others who are manifesting so much rahmah in response to that pain. And so you see that when someone is ill, you have the manifestation of rahmah, of people going and looking after them and shedding tears and so on. And all of this is resolved in the akhirah. So we have a few minutes of pain and suffering in this world and an eternity of bliss in the next. And as we know from the hadith, when a man goes to paradise, he will say, I've never experienced any pain or hardship in my life. It's as nothing. It dissolves in this ocean of bliss and happiness. And so one has to, there's a fine balance between seeming to be somehow lacking in human fellow feeling or compassion or empathy. And we can feel their pain very, very acutely. I remember, in the heat of the Gaza crisis, we're talking kind of end of 2023 and through 2024, I used to be following everything on an almost constant basis, and I'm not a person who cries, but I'd often have to just remove myself from company and go and cry, basically bitter tears, because I was seeing children dying on my phone. I was seeing their last moments. I was seeing really heart-wrenching moments. And I think there are so many of us who went through very similar experiences. And I think in a way that fellow feeling is a beautiful thing. When the Prophet ﷺ wept over his son, he told the companions that this is part of, aw kama qal, this is part of human nature and Allah's rahman, and Allah allows this. This is part of the human condition. It's part of being a good human being. And it doesn't take away from the terrible, the criminal nature of those who inflicted that pain. It doesn't make the pain all right, but it means that it's all for a greater purpose and it will be resolved in the akhirah. And that goes back also to our conception of happiness, because happiness is not just material well-being. It's not just living a life that, of an average length for no good reason and being well-fed and healthy and then dying, and that's somehow supposed to be our conception of happiness, although on a kind of Epicurean understanding of happiness as pleasure, or what we heard from John Stuart Mill, happiness is just pleasure in the absence of pain, you might think so. But on the Islamic conception, happiness involves flourishing and presupposes flourishing, but it is a purposeful flourishing. It's a flourishing in light of the nature of being, the nature of God's creation. And you might even call it a theomorphic flourishing, in the sense that in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in Imam Ahmad, خَلَقَ اللَّهُ آدَمَ عَلَى سُورَةِ الرَّحْمَنِ. Allah Ta'ala created Adam in the image of the All-Merciful. We find a similar thing in the Bible, and there's another wording which has another possible interpretation, but still the most clear interpretation. خَلَقَ اللَّهُ آدَمَ عَلَى سُورَتِهِ. God created Adam in his image. And so our conception of flourishing is a conception also of transcendence. It's a conception, and you find this also in the concept of altruism. Human beings can do things that don't seem to be in their immediate interests when it comes to material well-being. But they're acquiring thereby a kind of transcendent property. It's not, of course, a literal, it's not in any way becoming the divine or anything, because that's impossible, na'udhu billah. But it is in accordance with the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, تَخَلَّقُوا بِأَخْلَاقِ اللَّهِ, take on the character traits of God. And so some of those character traits are by being servants, and it's actually by being, well, it's all by being servants, but for example, al-muntaqim, the vengeful. We're not supposed to go around being the vengeful, but, or being, for example, having divine jealousy and so on. We respond to that with humility because that's our nature as abid. But there are also qualities, positive qualities like wisdom, like generosity and so on, which we try to surpass our selfish, limited, human, embodied, self-serving calculus about how generous can I be, and be utterly magnanimous. And in that way, we are, in a sense, transcending ourselves to be more like the incorporeal. And by participating in a certain way in something that transcends the bodily, because we have that dimension in us. We have this spiritual dimension which transcends the merely bodily. And that goes back again to the suffering of the martyr. I mean, how can the martyr, on Mill's definition of happiness, being sent to the stake, how can we say, as is so often recorded in history, that he went happy to the stake? But they say that.
Yeah. So we're contrasting Western philosophical views of happiness and sort of Islamic notions of happiness. And you've talked about how, the pleasure and pain sort of paradigm, utilitarianism, can be contrasted with sort of more sublime metaphysical ideals that Islam sets, coupled with the Shariah, which sets a standard for living, which if followed, then human beings have a level of happiness and contentment in their lives. I wonder how much, because another dimension of Western philosophy, or modern Western philosophy, is that of autonomy and individualism. I just wonder how much that connects with the subject of happiness. Like from a Muslim perspective, we tend to contrast the individuality that exists here in Western Europe and in America with that of community and the collective spirit that comes from ummah and community. How does that feed into this conversation of happiness, if it does?
I think it's very, very relevant. And that's because the happy person on the Islamic conception is equivalent to the free person, the person who has genuine freedom and who has achieved genuine freedom. And the definition of the free person in Imam al-Ghazali, he says, Al-hurru fi at-tahqiq man qahara shahwatahu. If you really investigate this matter carefully, he says, and get the right answer, the free person is the one who has conquered his own passions, he's conquered his own desire. And this, of course, very much contrasts with the broad post-Enlightenment conception of freedom, which for someone like Isaiah Berlin, in his very famous and important article, Two Conceptions of Liberty, essentially amounts to what he calls negative liberty, which is non-interference. And he considers there to be a bad kind of liberty as well, which he calls positive liberty, which is, well, the most fundamental form of this positive liberty is exactly the self-mastery we were just discussing, in the sense that, and he makes fun of this notion that there is a lower self and there is a higher self, and that in some sense, it's not that we have to get rid of the lower self, but it needs to be subordinated to the purposes and the interests of the higher self.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we aren't truly free. If we are bound by our attachments to things in this dunya, then we are not free to pursue our higher goals. And that's related actually to the reason that Allah Ta'ala tests us. In that verse in Surah Al-Baqarah, he says, I will surely test you with these things. Don't think you're getting away with it. You're definitely going to be tested. So don't be surprised when you are. It's part of the human condition. But what you need to say is, we're gods and we're returning to God, because it's a purificatory process to say that and to undergo those trials. But God tests us because we have to be tested until we stop identifying our happiness with transient, limited goods and things and beings and so on. And until we start to identify happiness just with the eternal, with not only the akhirah, but also, don't forget, the most important thing in the akhirah, the most beautiful thing in the akhirah, is the vision of Allah Ta'ala himself. That's the greatest happiness in the akhirah. So it's that kind of eternity. But when it comes to the question of community and the ummah and so on, absolutely. Ideally, well, I mean, it's something more urgent than just to say ideally, but we are faced with this epidemic of narcissistic individualism, which is also a manipulated individualism. We're the most manipulated generations in the history of the earth, because we're manipulated by media, we're manipulated by advertising, we're manipulated by the tyranny of the majority. And that takes us on a bit of a tangent, which I don't want to go there right now, but essentially, we've become a sub-philosophical society, even though we think that we're so advanced and sophisticated because of technology. And we are technologically extraordinarily sophisticated, but it doesn't mean that we're sophisticated in other areas. And we've actually become very, very much, in a way, sub-philosophical. And what that means, and this is one of the criticisms that Tocqueville made of democracy, even though he was a believer in democracy, and the same Mill, although he's a believer in democracy, is that this leads to a state of affairs where you have the tyranny of majority opinion manipulating the individual, because people are not well informed, because they're told everything's relative. There's no factor of the matter here. So if there's no fact of the matter, there's no truth to find out, in which case, what do? You simply follow the crowd. So now, I'm a big believer in community and the traditional conception of the family. However, I think we need to be careful not to have this kind of black and white, good and evil conception of liberalism and individualism, let's say individuality, or some nuance in between the two, on the one hand, and the hierarchical order and the family and strict hierarchy within the family and so on, gender roles and so on the other. Because I think what Islam really teaches is something that can see some truth in both, but is actually calling for a highly balanced and holistic treatment of both the needs of the individual to gain a real sense of individual purpose on the one hand, and our need to contribute to communities on the other. Because I think what we tend to go into is this kind of black and white and often reactive discourse that, liberalism bad, the West bad, individualism bad, modern conceptions of freedom bad, and we need to somehow revive these traditional conceptions. My belief is that the Islamic family and the way that we've held on to the family is a beautiful thing.
Right.
But I've seen so many examples where people are genuinely oppressed by their families as well.
Yeah.
And that's not Islamic in any way. It's very often a mistaking of culture for Islam.
Yeah.
So our actual conception of the relationship between the individual and the family is much more nuanced. In the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, when he talks about why we are overwhelmed by our enemies and we become very weak at the end of time, and the Sahaba can't imagine it because they're just about to take over the Persian and the Byzantine empires. You know, they have these extraordinary strong personalities, extraordinary chivalry and bravery and so on. They couldn't understand it. They said, is it because of our small numbers at that time? He said, no, you'll be in huge numbers. And look at us. But you'll be rothat ka rothat a sail. You'll be like the foam and detritus on the torrent. It literally means the scum and the rubbish, but that doesn't sound very nice. But it's actually a perfect translation. But foam and detritus is a nicer sounding way of saying the same thing. And we lack this substantiality. And I'm grateful to someone called Abdus Samad Clark for pointing out a very, very interesting interpretation of the torrent, because he looks at the torrent itself, the wave itself, as being modernity, being the power of the West in this time. And we're being swept along by that. And we're somehow, in some way, parasitic upon that torrent. We don't have our own substantiality. And so I think that essentially we should have a great prioritization of community and family, but not to the loss of building strong characters and, the shakhsiyah, the individuality and the individual character. We need to be strong, weighty human beings.
Right.
And I think this is very often a problem for Muslims today. And very often it's because we kind of disappear into the collectivity.
Right.
Yeah.
Because the collectivity notion sounds almost socialist in its sort of formation. And so your argument there is that, yes, there is an emphasis on the collective and the body and the ummah, but at the same time, there's a great emphasis on developing the self. So let's talk about the development of the self and individuality, because of course, that's different to maybe Western notions of individuality, which is all about desire and the expansion of desire. Here we're talking about the disciplining of the nafs, amongst other things that contribute to the shakhsiyah, to the personality. Just expand on that. Like, what is the difference between our conception of individuality, if that's the right phrasing?
I think it is, yeah.
And that of, say, Mill's conception of individuality?
Well, I think that essentially the fundamental difference is that we recognize that we have a very elevated anthropology. Man, as Shah Wali al-Dahlawi said, and many other of our great scholars have said, man is the meeting place of the angelic and the animal. We are an extraordinary being. The human being is an extraordinary being. We are this meeting place between different degrees of being. Yeah. We have the dimension of the animal. An animal, but we think of that kind of as an offensive term, but it's a very literal philosophical application. An animal in our tradition is defined as jism nami hassas mutaharrik bil irada, a growing body that's sensitive, can feel things, and moves by free volition. That's what it means to say that we're an animal. And it doesn't mean that we're literally angelic, but we're as if of the angelic realm in our intellectual capacity and our spiritual capacity. But in our hearts, we can, as it were, look in either direction. We can look up and try to order our lives in accordance with that higher aspect of our beings, or we can look down and become, as it says in the Quran, lower than the animals. So, and why do we become lower than the animals or higher than the angels? Well, we can do either because we span those different worlds, it's actually responsible for our free will, because we can choose that or we can choose that, and it's up to us. And in every scenario in life, to choose one or the other, whereas the angels, it says in the Quran, يَفْعَلُونَ مَا يُؤْمَرُونَ. They do as they're told. They have to do as they're commanded. They can't disobey even if they wanted to.
Yeah.
So the conception of individuality takes into account this very elevated anthropology. And it goes back also to what Tashko Prezada said in his definition of freedom, that there is actually a different freedom for each, happiness, that there is actually a different happiness for each individual, because there is a different kamal or perfection for each individual, because there is a different isti'adad. Everyone has their own purpose in life. It's not necessarily, for the vast majority of people, every role is valuable and very, very important and has its place. And no, I'm saying not for everyone, because the prophets obviously are genuinely more elevated and so on. But the point is, everyone has their own perfection that they're reaching. And that's why we talk about trying to find our purpose in life. Who am I? And in that sense, we tend to think of that as a kind of narcissistic, sad, Western kind of navel-gazing. But no, we need to ask that question. Who are we? What is our purpose? How are we going to contribute in elevating the ummah, rather than just, I'm part of the ummah and I'll do my duty. Of course, we do our duty, but we're in a state where we need to elevate the ummah, because we're not in a good state. And it's going to be elevated by individuals finding out who they really are and undergoing a purificatory process, which again is not some sort of weird esoteric Sufi thing. It's just the way that God's created the world, is he tests us. And people, especially in the modern world, we tend to be so surprised at the test. It's like, how can this be happening to me? It's so awful and so difficult. And they are so difficult, because we are created for truth, beauty and goodness and an eternal bliss in the akhirah. And we expect it now. And it doesn't happen, because we're in this world where we have loss and we have disappointment and things don't work out and everything's limited and everything comes to an end and people die and people get divorced and difficult and terrible things happen, unexpected things happen. And so the traditional conception of human nature expects this and understands it. It doesn't make it any less painful, but we have the example of Sayyidina Yaqub, for example, who experiences this wrenching pain. And, the expression in Arabic, Ya asafa ala Yusuf. I mean, it's a very, very powerful thing. But he also says, do not despair of God's comfort, because all things will be made right in God. And then at the end of Surah Yusuf, he says, didn't I tell you that I know from Allah what you did not know? Because he knew all along. But he still had to undergo that suffering. So it's a different conception of individuality, which allows for much more human variety in a way, but also a much more elevated human state.
And how do you understand the disciplining of the nafs in relation to this sort of conception of individuality? I mean, we hear you just have to go to an airport and you find a self-love book, or you find a wellness book and well-being book. I mean, that in a way extenuates sort of the desire mentality that probably pervades this wrong notion of happiness. Like, contrast that nafs and trying to guide the nafs to a higher order with that of sort of self-love, for example.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, it says in the Quran, "La talbisul haqq bil batil." Don't dress truth in falsehood. وَتَكْتُمُ الْحَقَّ, and thereby hide the truth. The thing is, there's often so much truth in these books. And the kind of people we need to be are people who are not, self-help is just kafir and bad. But we need to be empowered and confident and have the principles and the criteria genuinely from our own tradition to sort the wheat from the chaff there.
Yes.
So there's so often, that's the thing, you often have this feeling of regret, because it's like, well, I'd really like to like this book completely, because there's so much truth there. But of course, what we can do is just to enjoy what's true there and try to integrate it into a truer system. But yes, I mean, you have all of these concepts, self-love and affirmation and all this kind of thing in the self-help market. And I think what basically unites them is this confusion as to metaphysics. And by metaphysics, again, I just mean, what is your general picture of reality? What is reality? Is it purely material? And again, what's usually lying in the background there is this implicit materialism. It's not usually stated because they'd rather not go there. Sometimes it is stated, and they try to bring in this kind of pseudo-scientific evolution in self-help books that, you know, we did such and such to adapt because we were originally hunter-gatherers and that's why we should behave like this. And you find that cropping up in psychology and elsewhere. But most of the time, they simply avoid philosophical foundations, and that's why they're not able to tell you that there is any actual purpose, any objective purpose to human life. And so what are you going to do? You're going to be creating your own meaning. They talk about finding meaning in an objectively meaningless world. That's where they slip in the metaphysics. They slip in the part that's objectively meaningless. And you just want to ask, well, how do you know that it's objectively meaningless? And it's just the air that they breathe. It's just this assumption, which actually goes back to some very interesting changes in kind of early Enlightenment scientific thinking and philosophical thinking. But essentially, if the human being is a blank slate, there are no objective purposes, there are no objective essences of things, and all we have is our pure arbitrary freedom, then what is there other than self-creation? We're going to have to create meaning, because there's no meaning. We have to create our values. It's also going to be, you know, there's no objective morality, there's no objective beauty, there's no objective aesthetics. Whereas the traditional view is that God's creation is all beauty. It's all beauty because it comes from God. And knowing that beauty is love. That's why you come to love the people that you love. You love your religion, you love nature, you love all of these things. And love is duty. When you feel that love, you feel this duty to right wrongs, to establish justice, to preserve beauty, right? So it's fundamentally a very, very different conception, but that essentially arises from being aware that although there is a very important domain in human life, which is creative, and we shouldn't be bound by false institutions and false concepts that we over-concretize and we mistake for being natural when that's in fact the domain of human freedom. But nonetheless, not everything is up for grabs. There are some things, like gender, for example, which is a bit old hat now, but which are not up for grabs. They're real and immutable, and they're not choices. But the tendency there is to try to make everything into a choice. However, to be fair, and so as not to strawman that mentality, if you really believe that there's no objective purpose and there are no objective essences, then that is going to be your natural logical conclusion. And the real problem is, so many Muslims today, without realizing, actually do believe in that metaphysics. No objective essences, no purpose. And so that's why we tend to be so swayed by contemporary intellectual fashions, by fashions when it comes to wellness and self-help, and because we actually identify with that underlying logic. And you might ask, how could a Muslim believe that? Well, that's also because we've adopted a conception of faith as blind faith rather than a rationally rooted faith, a faith which is looking at existence and seeing that it's true. But we've adopted a kind of Lutheran blind faith model. So when I say that's their metaphysics, I'm not saying it's their professed belief about I believe in the Quran. Of course, there's a purpose. But the point is they don't believe that it's objectively knowable in a way that publicly binds all human beings outside of a kind of faith community. That's, again, one of the reasons why we lack this substantiality, because we don't tend to know how to talk to non-Muslims about these questions of objective truth and value and spirituality and so on, because we think of it as where it's our private faith. I don't want to bring my private faith into the discussion because it's awkward. I don't know how to deal with it. But of course, these are questions that have been discussed in a way that is accessible to anyone with an intellect for thousands of years by Plato and Aristotle, and then you see all of this crossover between the way that someone like Augustine looks at this similar questions, the way that Al-Ghazali looks at similar questions. But again, because of this implicit materialism and positivism that we grow up in, we tend to just, it's not even that we dismiss those kind of questions, we just don't even look at them in the first place.
Can a consumer society, one that depends on keeping people dissatisfied with their lives so that they constantly accumulate more and more material, can that type of society genuinely produce happiness?
I think that people can go an awful long way down that road thinking that they are happy.
Right.
As long as certain conditions are in place which don't vitiate that happiness, but that happiness will inevitably come to an end. But I think the idea that, let's say, you're a beautiful young woman who is essentially loved and respected, apparently, by everyone around you because of the status you have simply in virtue of your stage of life, and that you have plenty of money, and that you are attracting the kind of attention that you want to attract, and you have the means to continue to be desirable and at the cutting edge of the latest trends and the latest fashions and so on. I think that people can stay in that state of ghafla as long as those conditions are conducive.
Ghafla
being heedlessness, being a state of heedlessness and distraction might even be a better way of describing it.
Yeah.
For quite a long time,
Right.
because everything in the society is saying, yes, you're happy. This is happiness. And the point is, the thrill of having that vigor of youth and being beautiful and being admired by everyone and getting that attention, I think will keep people happy superficially. But of course, that's all going to come to an end at some point in the near future. And that is why there is such a fear and terror of aging in this society, and such an emphasis on youth. Because again, if, as Mill says, if broadly the modern world says happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain, well, that's only really possible when you're young and at the top of your game. And I think that's why so many accounts of aging and going through the different stages of life are now so pathetically oriented to trying to pretend to be young. And this is again a breakdown in having an objective conception of purpose and wisdom, because previously it was the elder who had mastered life, who you would really go to to find wisdom and find direction. And while today everyone's concerned with the latest cream to reduce wrinkles or whatever, Al-Ghazali had to tell people, you must stop dyeing your beard grey. It's haram. Because people would dye their beards grey in order to try to gain more respect, because there was such respect for the elder. So I think the consumer society, it's easy to say, no, of course it doesn't bring happiness. Of course it doesn't. But we also have to ask ourselves why it's so compelling to so many for so long. It's because we do have that dimension of instant gratification, and that is what it's offering us. And we can stay there for a long time. But what you find is in the aftermath, in the burnout, and when the requisite youth and beauty comes to an end, as it inevitably does, people are left with a terrible inward barrenness and in a real crisis.
I mean, there's a crisis in the Muslim community at the moment. I wonder whether it's because we're borrowing these sort of notions of happiness, the crisis of, of emphasizing too much the material, to the degree that men and women get to an age where they don't have children, they don't get married. If they are married, they're not, they haven't had children because they would like to go on a holiday. I mean, do you put a lot of that down to, even by the way, very practicing people would sometimes adopt and internalize some of these notions of individualism, or these notions of sort of the material gain being the sort of absolute height of what it means to be a human being. I mean, do you feel that we sometimes have subconsciously absorbed Western definitions of happiness, even though we speak sometimes an Islamic language?
I think very, very much so. And I think that, without wishing in any way to offend, but so many of the modern Muslims, whether they're modern Arabs or wherever it happens to be, and by the way, I aspire to being an honorary Arab. My prophet is Arab. My great sheikhs have been Arab. The language of paradise is Arabic, and the Prophet ﷺ said that people only hate the Arabs for hatred of me. So there's nothing anti-Arab intended here, but it's just a little bit of reflection, having lived in Arab countries for many, many years, for about 12 years or something, that exactly as you said, these conceptions of happiness as being material status and material gain have taken hold very, very powerfully now in the modern Arab world, for example, and across the rest of the Muslim world, where everything is about status symbols, keeping up with the neighbors, keeping up appearances, and also, I think, in a way, on the inward level and on the character level, it's often worse than the West.
Yeah.
And this is often the case when, and one likens it to the example of the beautiful face that gets burnt, or there's some sort of terrible accident and they lose their beauty, right? Actually being uglier than someone who was just born not very attractive. And I think this is a similar case in where you actually have this encouragement. Again, it's the way that we have to be a bit careful of blindly advocating the Islamic family. Of course, we advocate it, but the real Islamic family, not just any quote-unquote Islamic family where there's actually a lot of oppression, where there's an actual advocacy of character traits like envy, prejudice, ostentation, and these are all seen as, perhaps not explicitly, but in practice, as all perfectly valid and really signs of our dignity and pride and so on. And so one way of summing it up really is much more straightforward. It's simply to say that materialism has taken hold. And that's very often because, again, we've lost a genuinely Islamic worldview. And instead, we have this kind of implicit materialism. I don't mean materialism in the sense of acquiring worldly goods and being obsessed with worldly goods, but I'm talking about in the philosophical sense. And positivism, this idea that the only real knowledge is that provided by the natural sciences and everything else is just subjective. That's absolutely taken hold. I mean, it's mainstream now across the Muslim world. And there are many wonderful people who are great exceptions and who are teachers in that regard. But absolutely, I would say that remains a huge problem. I think one of the worst things is that we look for our worth and our sense of self-value to fashion and to the opinion of others. And sometimes that's not actually conducive either to genuinely Islamic maqasid and purposes or to our own flourishing at all. You know, Sartre said, hell is other people. And again, it's a very, very bleak view of existence, but there is a grain of truth in it. What he meant by saying hell is other people is that we get into our feeling of being in a hellish state is when we think of how others are viewing us. Such so-and-so thinks we're like this, you know, and I need to be such a certain way in order to be accepted and so on. Whereas what it says in the Quran, I think this is, you know, one of the very important things we need to remember in this time is أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم جعلوا فتنة الناس كعذاب الله فإذا أوذي في الله جعلوا فتنة الناس كعذاب الله. Right? When they are tested in the way of Allah, when they undergo harm or some form of pain, or whatever it happens to be, in the way of Allah, they make the fitna, right? Whether it's the censure of people or the people just causing trouble or the slander of people or whatever it happens to be, that the terrible experiences that they undergo because of having difficulty with people, they make it equivalent to God's punishment. They make it into hell, right? But it's not hell, right? You know, keeping up with the Joneses, keeping up with the neighbors, looking fashionable, and you find this again and again. Very often, Muslim families want to send their children, for example, into professions which are socially prestigious. And they couldn't care less whether it's actually what the ummah needs. But what we need now are a generation of Muslim parents whose primary concern is not keeping up with the Joneses or the Khans or whatever it is, but are genuinely trying to pursue Islamic maqasid.
Fantastic. How do you understand the rise of the mental health discourse that has begun maybe to replace? I mean, you know, of course, we can be extreme and just dismiss it, and that's inappropriate and wrong. And of course, Islam has a very strong tradition of psychology and psychiatry, but there is this dominant mental health discourse now that we see that pervades the world, really. And how do you see that, contrasting or creating tension with like Islamic concepts of sabr and rida and tawakkul and these sorts of ideas that allowed the human being to endure and to be steadfast when it comes to troubles and anxieties?
Absolutely. I think very often when people feel that they're undergoing a serious mental health crisis, very often it is the case that they can't make sense. We can't make sense of our suffering because we can't see the bigger picture. And that's really exactly the main contrast that we've been discussing today, is that if you can see that suffering and tribulation is making you into a better person, is elevating you, if you pass the test, if you respond well to it, you actually are achieving, you're becoming the person that you need to be. In the words of Toshko Brazada and the Islamic ethical tradition, you are reaching your kamal through undergoing those trials. But if you can't see a purpose and it just seems gratuitous pain, then it can cause an inability to cope where one's categories fall apart, the intelligibility of the world comes apart at the seams. And I, like so many, I used to dismiss all of the mental health discourse as being just kind of self-indulgent, modern kind of finding yourself distraction and the therapeutic society and so on. And I think there is a certain degree of truth to that, but as life has gone on, I've realized that it's really the time that we're living in. People really are going through what you could genuinely describe as trauma. A lot of people have really undergone traumatic experiences. The problem is not being able to deal with it. And dealing with it in terms of a framework of qadar, nothing takes place, ma sha Allah kan wa ma lam yasha lam yakun. What Allah willed is what will inexorably happen, and what He does not will can never happen. Nothing could actually be any other way. And we are servants of God. And our existence is a gift. We used to be in Adam, in nothingness, in non-existence. And with respect to this embodied world, we'll go back into non-existence. Of course, we know that that's not pure non-existence. It's another stage of being. And this life is a gift. And no one said, oh, by the way, we guarantee that everything will be happiness and flowers and joy and ease. That was never promised us. When did that become an existential right? It was never given to us, but what was given to us was the gift of life, and it's enough for us to have a route to truth, goodness, and beauty by following the prophets, by following the Shariah, by conforming ourselves to the requirements of objective morality and duty. And the point is that awareness of the hierarchy of being always gives us a way out. We can always say, well, whatever suffering I undergo, there's still truth, goodness, and beauty. It's still there. They say it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Why? Because participating in that beauty, in that love, makes it worth being here, regardless of what happens. And when you believe that if you, just to put it crudely, are good, that's where you will dwell. Al-mar'u ma'a man ahab, as the Prophet ﷺ said. Everyone is with who they love. The point is there's a natural affinity. He also said, Al-arwahu junudun mujannada. Man ta'arafa minha talaf wa ma tanakara minha ikhtalaf, right? When you meet someone, you find that there's this natural affinity, right? I get on with this person. They understand me. I understand them, right? Or sometimes you meet people and you just can't get on with the person. And that's because we have, in our state in God's knowledge, we have these intrinsic natures, and some people have this affinity and some people do not. And that's because of the qualities that they embody. So there's always a way back to realizing that everything can be resolved in the best possible way. Whereas if you don't believe that there's an akhirah, and you don't even believe that there's objective truth, good beauty and goodness in this world, then one will succumb genuinely to despair. And I think it is that inability to process what's happening, to make sense of it, that can lead to kind of genuine mental deterioration. So I don't see it, as I previously did, as basically a modern fad. I see it as really more of a sign of the times and really something quite serious.
Our inability to deal with some of these tragedies and traumas that we face. Okay, that's really interesting. So let's strip this all back then and tie this conversation together. Like, how does one genuinely then lead a happy life? And what does that look like from an Islamic lens?
Happiness in the Islamic tradition is in overcoming fear, overcoming fear of creation, servitude to creation, by only fearing Allah Ta'ala and only being a servant to Allah Ta'ala. And that makes us free, from creation and able to pursue the intrinsic goodness and beauty that Allah Ta'ala has placed in His creation. And happiness is our going on the journey of life, not being afraid of pain and suffering, because we see that all will be resolved in God, in God's justice, in God's goodness, in this world and the next, and that the purpose of that suffering is purification, so we can reach the uniquely human perfection of being the vicegerent of God on earth because of our unique status, the very special kind of being we are, where we're the meeting place between the angelic and the animal. And we are called in our vicegerency to elevate all of creation, the environment and the animals and human institutions and the whole of creation, so that it is closer to the divine and closer to the spiritual and closer to the incorporeal. And so that God's rule extends, we are, as it were, I don't mean literally, but we are, as it were, God's instrument to extend His rule across all of the worlds. So it's a very beautiful vision of human happiness, and it's one where, unlike in the Western conception again, where you can have all of the self-help books in the world and all the wellness in the world, and then at the end of it all, I'm still unhappy. But for a person who is healthy inwardly and outwardly, this is equivalent to happiness.
Fantastic. And one final question, Ben. So is the real difference here, if we were to just strip it all back and contrast Western notions of happiness about living well and material gain, pleasure and pain, would we contrast that with, an Islamic form of happiness, which is really about ending well? It's about, living your life in a way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seeks. You seek pleasure in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and living and ending well, so that you can embrace what is ultimate, unlimited happiness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Absolutely, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. And I'd also just add that it's also living well in this world, because that's Allah Ta'ala's will. It's the way He's set up creation. He says those who follow His way will, He says, لَنُحْيَنَّهُ حَيَاةً طَيِّبًا. We will give them life in a really good life, a good, wholesome, rich life, not a constricted, difficult life.
Yeah.
He says, قُلْ مَنْ حَرَّمَ زِينَةَ اللَّهِ التي أخرج لعباده الطيبات من الرزق قُلْ هِيَ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا فِي الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا خَالِصَةً يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. He says, don't forbid. Who forbids the ornamentation of this life, the good things in this life, the beautiful things in this life? Right? Because Allah created them for the mu'min, even in this life. The one who's not a mu'min gets to enjoy them in this life, but they're for the mu'min even in this life. And in the akhirah, solely for the mu'min, because of course the one who's not a mu'min will not have them in the akhirah. So there are two different conceptions of religion, which I think are universal. It's a universal question and struggle, really, in different religious traditions, including in the Islamic tradition, which is religion just this exchange? I'll put up with deprivation here if you give me more of the pleasure I want in the akhirah. So I'm kind of giving up a finite quantum of pleasure here so that I can have an infinite quantum of pleasure in the akhirah. Or is it a celebration of God's truth and beauty and goodness in this life, and the halawat al-iman, the sweetness of a faith that results from that? And then out of love for Allah Ta'ala, you conform yourself to His way and His Shariah, and you become that real servant of God, but out of love, and so that you can see His face in the akhirah. So I think that's the difference.
Hasan Spiker, it's really been a pleasure. I've been very happy speaking to you today.
Alhamdulillah.
Thank you so much. And inshallah, we'd love to invite you back on to talk about this and many other philosophical topics.
I'd be delighted.
Thank
you
so
very much.
Jazakallah khair.
Wa yakum.
Assalamu alaikum. Now you've reached the end of this show, and the fact that you've stayed until the very end tells me that you truly believe in our work. Please consider making a one-off donation or becoming a member by visiting thinkingmuslim.com/membership. Now, your contributions give you exclusive behind-the-scenes access and the ability to ask questions to our guests, and monthly calls with myself, my team, and our guests like Sami Hamdi. Jazakallah khair, and keep us in your